Good morning. It is 6:27 a.m. on Monday, September 19th, 2016. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just got up. This is 5 more minutes. So, today, one day delayed after it was supposed to be scheduled for yesterday, I'm going to be talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender Season 1, Episode 4, The Warriors of Kyoshi. So, this episode is one of my favorite of the early episodes. It is where I think, as I kind of described, the first 3 episodes sort of establish the world, and then move us forward with this is how we are going to be proceeding. And so this is the first episode that in some ways could be seen like a filler episode. This is a bit like I talked about when I was talking about the Star Wars Clone Wars show. It could be seen as a filler episode in that there's not a lot that happens in a concrete way that advances the main plot. But what we do is we take a sidestep to deepen the world building, broaden the world building, and also to use that it's not just for deepening the world building, which is a good enough thing on its own, but also explaining why that matters and using it to move the personal story of each character forward. We don't get a whole lot from Zuko this episode, so I don't want to get too far. I'll just basically cover him first. Mostly with him, we get just a couple of gags. The first one being, one that's on the weaker side for this show, which is he's meditating and Iroh comes in and says, I've got news, but promise you won't be mad. And he's like, of course I won't be mad. And then it's like, oh, we don't know where the Avatar is. And then he's mad. It's a pretty obvious gag, and it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it, except that it's just sort of obvious. Whereas the show is often a little sharper than that. The other one's a little better, which is that after a kind of cool little montage where we see how word of Aang's travels reaches Zuko, he learns that the Avatar has been spotted just as he is served a fish dinner, and he immediately stands up. It's time to go after him right away. And then he storms out, and then Iroh's looking down at his fish that Zuko was going to eat and is like, are you going to eat that? And then Zuko kind of storms back in, grabs the plate. I was saving it for later. And that's just a little funnier. It's just weird little, almost Odd Couple type gags between the villain and his number 2 in this case. But that's really all we get from Zuko this week. But all 3 of our 3 heroes each really get their own lesson. I guess Sokka and Aang more of a lesson than others. But even Katara gets one of her own. So Sokka starts the episode with more of his boys' work and girls' work stuff, and we see also that he is like I think it's a well observed detail that it's almost a reflex to say that kind of stuff. It's not thought out. It's not like he's really considered it and has concluded that sewing is girls' work and all that. It's just like this assumption, and we can kind of tell that just on the basis of him not being aware enough to recognize that making a big deal about that in front of his sister, who he knows is not going to agree with him on this, while she is trying to repair his pants. She is doing it for him, and he's like, oh yeah, Aang, don't interrupt a girl when she's sewing. That sort of thing. And so that sets us up for when we meet the warriors of Kyoshi, who are very cool and their look with the makeup and the fans and the uniform, and the uniform being thought out, like each like component of it means something, as we learn later. Uh, they take our gang out immediately, because our gang is honestly not that much of a threat yet. Even Aang, as the Avatar, is is can be taken by surprise. But Sokka is saying, "What? We were taken by a bunch of girls? Well, it was a sneak attack. That doesn't count." And so, we're setting up here with another kind of standard cartoon sort of lesson with him. It's a little bit like the first episode, where it's basic stuff, but it also seems like it's going to be a little deeper. And sure enough, what we see is that he is so convinced that it was only because they took him by surprise that he needs to go prove it. So he decides he wants to go spar with them. But they read his energy right away, which is that he thinks he's better than them. And so they are willing to demonstrate quite embarrassingly that he is not. They are trained martial artists, and he is a kid who has learned to be a reasonably good fighter, relatively speaking, but they are trained martial artists and warriors. It's different, and so they embarrass him. And this is where, again, the show takes things to a deeper level than a lot of other cartoons, where in a lot of cartoons it would be bad enough to just make the sexist character like the bad guy or the buffoon, and it would be just enough to humiliate him, and then that's the lesson, is that, oh, if you're sexist, you're going to get embarrassed, and that's all there is to it. But in this show, we see the deeper side of Sokka. Once that embarrassing event kind of breaks through his sort of bravado, his learned bravado, he recognizes they really were better than me, so maybe I could actually learn something from them. And it really only takes a little while of sulking outside before he goes back and he says, "I was wrong. Please help me. I would love to learn from you." And he is willing to do that even when they put some restrictions on him that are a little embarrassing, like making him wear their uniform, which is, girly. It's got the makeup and it's kind of dressed like robe. But he really does learn from them. He really comes to respect their traditions in that way. And I think that the strength of character needed for him to go back there after being embarrassed, rather than to have just, obtained a grudging respect from being embarrassed, but to actually go back and humble himself. Like, that's a step that you don't see as much in these cartoons. And then that's echoed later when we get a little chemistry between them. We get chemistry when they're training, but then also towards the end when they're kind of fighting off the Fire Nation soldiers, and he says, I treated you like a girl when I should have treated you like a warrior. And that's a perfect example of him making progress, but not quite there yet. And that's where she is willing to add the grace note of giving him a little kiss, indicating that the chemistry is mutual there, and just saying, I am a warrior, but I'm also a girl. They are not incompatible things. It's not that she is a warrior instead of a girl. It's that warriors can be girls. They are not incompatible. They are not mutually exclusive. And again, it's more nuanced than I think a lot of cartoons, even well-meaning ones, would get into. Meanwhile, we've got Aang, who we get some nice detail about sort of his backstory. We see another one of his. Actually, I think this may be the first of his incarnations that we learn a little bit more about. Specifically, one of his past incarnations being Avatar Kyoshi, who was an Earthbender from the Earthbender Nation, and then and also a woman. And so it's just kind of a they don't really comment on it, but it's just a pointing out that his past lives, it may be him in a sense that he's being reborn, but he is being reborn as different people each time, and they're not always the same. It's not just one Aang after another. And it's a nice detail that once he proves that he's the Avatar, the town starts to kind of, spruce up their statue of Kyoshi. But here's where we get the dynamic of what is their drive right now. Because they know that they're on the run from the Fire Nation. And they know that they have a plan, which is to go to the North Pole and to have Aang and Katara learn waterbending. But other than the fact of running from the Fire Nation, there doesn't seem to be a lot of pressure on Aang right now. Or at least if there is, he is not accepting it. He is not accepting the pressure. He's just kind of letting it flow by him. Because he's having them fly all over the place looking for, fun animals to ride on. And so when he finds this place that suddenly is so impressed because he reveals he's the Avatar, that they're just fawning all over him, this is where we see that, he may be the Avatar, but he is not perfect. He lets the attention kind of go to his head. And even as he says, oh, I'm just a simple monk, he then kind of looks out the window to smile at his screaming, adoring fans. And he kind of, this is, we deepen the through line of him having a crush on Katara, which is that even as he's appreciating all of this attention, and we get a bunch of gags related to that, it seems obvious to him that, or rather, it's obvious to us, that the attention that he really wants is from Katara. But not only is she not, she doesn't respect his sort of show-off tendencies. Related to that, we get the first appearance of a running gag through the series, which is Aang's little favorite airbending trick, which is just, it's little marble-sized balls of air that he just spins around in his palm, and it's like, all things considered, with all the different stuff he can do, it's not very impressive, but Aang is just very pleased with himself every time he does it, and that's always, it's fun how that continues to come back. But what Aang is not realizing here is that it's not his ability to show off and do fancy tricks that is what has impressed Katara. Katara respects more, I don't want to say just the Avatar side of him, but the part of him that recognizes his importance to the world. And so he's a little frustrated when he keeps trying to make it all about doing tricks and she's not responding to that. And then once she starts to get jealous about the attention and frustrated that they're sticking around so long, we see him kind of start to double down and doing things like wanting to go back and ride this giant eel that they found in the water. And it's very obviously a ploy to like, he is doing something he thinks that she'll disapprove of, like to kind of provoke that response. But by this point, she's kind of checked out by all of his behavior. And so they have kind of a fight. But what's nice is that she changes her mind. And that kind of so she decides, you know what, even though I'm mad and he's doing something dumb just to make me mad, I still care about him. I still don't want him to do something dumb, so I'm going to at least go and see. And this comes at the same time that Aang is starting to realize that that sort of fame is fleeting. It's like when you get attention just by showing off and doing tricks for people all the time, when you're on, like, there becomes this pressure to not be boring. Like, you keep having to escalate what you're doing in order to keep impressing people, and then they get bored with you if you can't keep it up. Whereas people who appreciate you on a deeper level are going to stick around. That's a good lesson too. But then that sort of personal level lesson is matched with the recognition that the attention he was receiving is a double-edged sword in another way, which is people are very excited to have the Avatar return. They're given a place to stay, supplies, and all of these things. But it's also true that people are so excited that they tell their friends, and those friends tell their friends, and it goes on in a chain, which is how Zuko finds out. But it's also, I think, worth noting that it broadens, or rather, it blurs the dividing lines between this in a subtle way, because it's easy to think of, well, the Fire Nation is the bad guys, and the other nations are the good guys, and so why would there ever be a communication between the bad guys and the good guys? But this little montage where we see the little girl telling the ship captain as she gives him the fish, oh, the Avatar. And then that ship captain tells this fish seller that he's selling to, and then that fish seller is selling to a Fire Nation soldier. And then, so it just kind of shows that the lines are a little blurrier than we might have been led to believe. And so what Aang recognizes, though, is that by staying in Kyoshi so long, he allowed the news to reach Zuko, and now Kyoshi was under attack very explicitly and directly because Aang stayed there so long, when he knows that Katara was warning him of that exact possibility. And so that's a recognition of his larger responsibilities that Aang kind of receives here too. And that's where this little sidetrack of learning about this cool island of Kyoshi and their warriors and that history, but also using that to advance this character stories. Katara gets a smaller amount too. I kind of touched on it a little bit already too, which is just this idea that feeling a little frustrated and jealous with her, with her traveling companion Aang here, but at the same time also being able to move past that feeling, that emotional feeling, and to understand and respect the deeper priorities beneath it. Not letting being angry at Aang in the moment doesn't need to stop her from supporting him in the big things. We also get a really cool moment. We see her continuing to practice her waterbending, even still absent a teacher. So she's determined with this. And then we also get a really cool moment where Aang, having almost drowned, she waterbends the air out of his lungs, which is that's a neat trick, especially for someone who's untrained and basically just kind of figuring it out on her own. Aang's certainly not helping her out because he doesn't know waterbending yet and doesn't seem all that interested in it yet. Like, it's in abstract, oh yeah, I guess I'm supposed to do that, but that's it. What I will say is that I think that the giant eel in this episode, like that first joke that I mentioned with Zuko, is a little easy. The idea that it's this giant monster, and then it's a giant monster he's going to try to ride when it's reckless and dangerous. And then the third time he's just immediately able to have it do exactly what he wants, which is to spray the water on the fires in the village. And I'm happy the village doesn't burn down, but that just seemed unearned a little bit. I think that element of this episode is not a show at its strongest. But there's so much other great stuff in this episode that it's one of my favorites. So we're continuing to build, and we're going to have a few more episodes coming up of these little side stories before we get into advancing the A-plot some more. All right, so I will try to be back on Sunday next week with Avatar Season 1, Episode 5, The King of Omashu. Talk to you then.